Okay, welcome everybody to this evening's panel on imperialism, forms, flows, and cross-currents under the auspices of the Global Humanities network. And just for those who have joined us from outside the network, just to say that for the last 2 days, we've been for the first time in-person conversations with 6 partnering universities from across the world, and really warm welcome to them again and to Cambridge. This is, as it were, the kind of public-facing event of our 2-day meeting. And it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome our guests here, and including Professor Debesh Chakrabarty, who happened to be visiting the university on another occasion. So he's just been busted into this, and I'm very grateful for him. He's a good friend that way.
I'm the one starts with a clean slate.
So I think we're going to change the order a little bit from what is advertised. And I'll introduce all the panelists in one go in the sequence in which they're speaking. First up, Dr. Lian Bi Zhu, who is an associate professor of history at Fudan University. She is a specialist in the history of the British Empire, particularly Dominions and Canada, and is widely published on 19th and 20th centuries in Chinese, and her work particularly focuses on the question of national holidays in Canada, so memory, nationalism, and remembrance. She will be followed by our very own Professor Hans van der Ven, who is a professor of modern Chinese history here at Cambridge and a fellow of this college, St. Catherine's. He's, of course, very widely published, again, on 19th and 20th centuries, but on China. And his books include From Friend to Comrade, Founding of the Chinese Communist Party, War and Nationalism in China, and most recently, China at War, Triumph and Tragedy in the Emergence of New China, 1937 to 1952. He is also the co-director of the Global Humanities initiative, and also major spirit behind it. Then from Ashoka University, India, Dr. Malvika Maheshwari, who is an associate professor of politics, and her work is on the intersection on the study of political thought as well as art practice. And she's also widely published. Her 2019 Oxford University Press book is entitled Art Attacks, Violence and Offense-Taking in India. So freedom of expression, very current contemporary debates are part of her work. Her latest new and ongoing work, and welcome back, you were at Crash earlier this year, is on national art academies in post-colonial India. So we'll hear a little bit, I gather, on it today from you. And last but not the least, Professor Debesh Chakrabarty, who is the Lawrence A. Kinton Distinguished Professor in History at the University of Chicago, where he serves also on a number of other departments, and is a founding member of the influential Subaltern Studies Collective, and also an editor, a consulting editor of Critical Inquiry. His wide-ranging and influential works include Provincializing Europe, which we all know, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, and hot of the press, which I'm very lucky to get a copy of yesterday, One Planet, Many Worlds, The Climate Parallax, which is just out. So very wide-ranging work from labor history to post-colonial theory to now the Anthropocene and climate change. So the idea would be that each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and then there will be some moderated conversation, not too long, from this side of the table, and then we'll open up for question and answer. So on to you, Lian.
And thank you, Shruti, and thank you for Hans to join us and to inviting me to today's discussion. And it's quite a privilege to make the speech first. Instead of talking about something about conceptual or theoretical review of imperialism, I will discuss the teaching of the history of Western European empires in China through the museums. Since 2016, I have taught a general education course on Western European colonial empires from the 16th to the 20th century, based on my personal research interests. The course is available to all undergraduate students at my university, and falls under the module entitled Dialogue Between Civilizations and Global Perspectives. The aim of the course is to instill an international perspective in students and to promote their development as global citizens. Like other teachers in the university, I use slides, stories, and historical sites to provide a comprehensive overview of various perspectives, historiographies, and primary sources related to empires and imperialism in less than 15 lectures. All students are expected to have a basic understanding of modern colonial empires and use Chinese, English, and other modern European languages as their working language. Despite the limited teaching hours and extensive scope in time and space, the course has become quite popular to my surprise, with over 300 students applying for just 60 seats in 2020. Actually, most of the Chinese university students I know are always curious about the past and the present of the international community, even in this decoupling world. The course's first lecture focuses on etymology and historiography, exploring the synchronic and diachronic differences between colony and empire and their derivatives, such as imperialism. The following 4 lectures illustrate a general history of how Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, British, German, and Italian colonial empires developed and declined in the past 5 centuries. By reading colonists' correspondences, travel diaries, maps, advertisements, as well as academic articles and monographs. Students need to learn the differences among these empires chronologically and geographically, and the history of formal and informal empires. From East Indian Company to Elizabethan cake recipe, the third section of the course opens to the students who join the thematic lectures by giving presentations covering religion, the Great Divergence, warfare, and decolonization. Other lectures cover gender, knowledge, policies, virtual representations, and etc. I'd like to highlight 2 examples of how to use museum in my teaching. The first museum is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I think most of you have heard of it. While many of my students may never get a chance to visit, they learned about Queen Victoria and the Victorian era via their high school textbooks. Although the V&A seems to have a weaker connection to colonization compared to the British Museum, it represents various Victorian perspectives on what empire meant. I utilized various photos I took in the museum in my PowerPoint slides, such as Turget's column and the effigy of King Richard I of England from the Westcott Court, the mosaic in the pediment of the north facade, and the architectural model of the vanished Crystal Palace from the British Gallery. These examples allowed me to compare the different representations of empire in Roman, Angevin, and the British empires. The creation of the plaster casters of Turget's column and effigy of Richard I in the 1850s, the mosaic of Queen Victoria in the Roman style, and the V&A's connection to the 1851 Great Exhibition showed that this museum not only demonstrated the accomplishment of the Industrial Revolution after the 1851 exhibition, but also provided a different interpretation of a Britain living in an empire across time. Both the Crystal Palace and the V&A Museum have a kind of space that builds a new community of shared knowledge with a similar panoramic perspective and confirms the legitimacy of sustaining the empire. They turn the empire from an idea to a visible reality. So in this case, we not only discuss the collections or one specific object of the museum, but explore its history, ways of exhibition, and function. The case of V&A served as an inspiration for my students to explore the other local museums and exhibitions which has connections to colonial empires. In each semester, one group of 5 students must visit the museum called the Tushaowan Museum to finish their presentation. This museum, funded by Shanghai municipal government, is a much smaller museum compared to the V&A. It's located in the Xuhui district, close to the St. Ignatius Cathedral. This cathedral was called the grandest cathedral in the Far East when accomplished in 1869. In 2010, the Tushaowan Museum was established to showcase its renowned collections that have won medals at various international exhibitions, such as the Paris Expo 19,000, Honey Expo 1902, St. Louis 1904, San Francisco 1915, and many others. In 1864, several French Jesuits established an orphanage at the site of today's Tushaowan Museum. which was part of the Shanghai Catholic diocese. And it included 21 different institutions, such as an observatory, schools, monasteries, and a library. The Tushawan orphanage was transformed into a workshop very quickly for kids to learn a variety of skills, such as painting, sculpture, printing, woodcutting, goldsmithing, and photographic crafts. Although the French missionaries in the Tushawan orphanage dressed in Chinese way and had a Chinese name, they transmitted European knowledge to train Chinese orphans. Chinese kids then combined European knowledge and skills with local aesthetics and achieved international fame with the support of the French missionaries. Tushawan orphanage thus turned into an educational institute and center for religious and scientific publication, as well as a famous workshop for handicrafts. Notably, Leopold II of Belgium was among the famous buyers of their woodcutting designed by French missionaries and made by Chinese workers. So during my students' visit of the Tushawan Museum last year, I invited a colleague who happened to notice an elegant mantle candlestick on the display was identical to one in his home. He remembered it was a gift from a French missionary who had stayed in Shanghai during the mid-20th century. Additionally, he was surprised by the museum's conclusion. From his view, its narrative was much less critical than his expectation that only portrayed the positive influence of the missionaries in Tushawan orphanage. And in the students' presentation of the Tushawan Museum last year, they illustrated the biography of an orphan called Shi Kang to show the history of the Tushawan workshop. They also quoted from missionary archives that share the way of the narrative of the conclusion. I asked the students two questions after their presentation. The first is why they quoted the missionary assessment word by word without any critical comments, and what the advantage is to integrate a person's biography, in this case an orphan, with the general history of European missionaries in Shanghai to interpret the local history. By investigating the past and objects of the Tushawan Museum, students can learn the complexity of religious power in the reach of informal colonial empires. A new community of shared knowledge established in Tushawan later changed the local aesthetics into a hybrid one, and European knowledge was sustained without remarkable resistance. Leaning on examples of how to utilize the history and objects of the V&A Museum and the Tushawan Museum, it is possible to illustrate the flows of information, people, handicrafts, and many others in the past 5 centuries. Both museums show how a community of shared knowledge was established and how it altered the membered understanding of the world. They are more than a place for preserving the memory and objects of a nation's past, but an representation of complex interactions of humans. The students incorporated their interests and reflections in their final essays. I came across several stories about how their hometown, which may not be considered as a typical colony, was impacted by European influences during the last 2 centuries. The students' language proficiency allowed them to investigate research questions beyond China. One essay that stood out to me was a biographical analysis of Eusebio de Silveira Freire. I don't know if anyone come to across this name, also known as the Black Panther, a Portuguese footballer of Mozambique origin. I'm quite appreciated that students in this course keep an eye on the interaction among people, which is a basic approach to being a global citizen. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, just make sure that this mic, it seems to be working. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shruti. I want to talk about a person some of you know and some of you will not know. That person is Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. I may not be pronouncing that correctly, for which I apologize. He visited a place that some of you, probably the other half, will know, and others will not know, and that place is Chongqing. Chongqing was the capital of China, nationalist China, free China. And this visit took place in May 1944. Mm-hmm. We know about it because of a report about it, written by, again, a person some of you will know and some of you won't know, might guess, KPS Manon.
Oh, okay.
nationalists. So he traveled with them. I should just explain a bit of backgrounding, but I think it's a very interesting moment that deserves unpacking in a couple of ways. So for those of you who don't know, Chongqing, by May 1944, was the capital of nationalist China. It was a bombed-out city. People lived underground. So that was people worked at night rather than during the day. China itself at this point was undergoing the Ichigo offensive, so nationalist armies were being swiped away all of China. But it was also Chongqing was also, as the capital of China at this point, was a very interesting place because it brought a lot of people together from all countries, including diplomats, journalists, military types, cultural types. There were movie stars, there were great chefs who later went on to Taiwan largely. But so it was a very happening place. And there were also representatives from various competing nationalist movements from Korea, Vietnam.
Just 1 second.
Say that the Polish referring system is terrible.
Okay. I will, if I
Oh, okay,
lean in
thank you
more,
for saying that. Yeah.
if I lean in more to the microphone. All right, but I'll do my best. Anyway, so Chongqing it's sort of a forgotten capital in the Second World War, but it is a very interesting one because so many things were happening there. KPS Manon was a product of the Indian civil service. He was at that point the agent general of India in China. He couldn't be called the ambassador because he's not independent yet, but effectively that's what he was. And he later would become India's first foreign secretary. And he interestingly sort of imbibed the articulateness of the British civil service, the kind of vivid writing which made this particular document fun to read. Radhakrishnan was a great scholar of Indian thought, famous in India then and now. He became president, but he also had a real fondness for Britain. I think he liked nothing better than spending his time in Oxford rather than Cambridge, because he was a fellow of all sorts. So that kind of, so he too combined various worlds in interesting ways. His response to the crisis of his day, to war, violence, so on, was to argue that technological, scientific, and industrial change had brought the world closer and rapidly.
Change the mic system. It's making it otherwise you're going to use this.
This is not.
Sorry, you got to.
Is this on now? Yeah. Okay. I trust. Should I begin again? We don't want to do that.
No, that's okay.
I mean, Radhakrishnan, great scholar. He later became president of India. He was a confidant of Nehru. I've been going through his archives at Ashoka University. It's absolutely wonderful, very insightful. You learn a lot about people that way. Technology, science, industry, and so on, according to him, had brought the world closer, had rapidly globalized it, but it was the West's failure to attend to spiritual cultivation that explains the disaster in which he and the whole world at that time lived. And that sort of East-West dichotomy and blaming the West for the disaster of the Second World War was, of course, something that Chinese scholars with which he and cultural people with he would agree with, right? People like Chen Wu have very much the same sort of sense of history and analysis. And I think what's sort of the meetings that he had are very interesting because they bring out lots of different kinds of flows and circulations across empire. So the first person that Radhakrishnan met was, according to KPS Manon, the living Buddha from Tibet. That probably, not entirely sure, but probably was the Dalai Lama that is still with us today. There are many living Buddhas in Tibet, so we can't be sure, but presumably he'd just been chosen and was there in Chongqing. And that hints at a world of Tibetan Buddhism, connections between India and China, and so on. And it also hints, this is the past, but people that emerged in that past are still very much with us. Or some of them are with us today. So it's not actually a very far away past, which puts us in a specific position. Radhakrishnan also met the high and mighty, people like T.V. Soong, great financial expert, H.H. Kong, one of the most corrupt, but also one of the most efficient and effective financiers but also somebody like Chen Li-fu. And Chen Li-fu was a great promoter of new understandings of Confucianism. He also met religious leaders such as the great master Taixu, one of the great Buddha masters at the time. And Taixu, which I hadn't known, he had been in India and had met Gandhi and Nehru. And I don't know those histories, but they're there, I think, to be uncovered for us. He also met, and this is slightly ironic, a person named Feng Yuxiang, who was known as the Christian warlord. He was more a warlord than a Christian, but in this time, at this meeting, he was presented as a representative of Chinese Christians, as well as Bai Zhongxi. Bai Zhongxi, one of the great strategic minds of modern China, also a Muslim and standing up for Muslims in China at the time. So a really interesting set. And yet this turned out to be a dialogue that simply failed to happen. It didn't work. At the National Central University, he gave a talk. He talked about a civilization without, I'm just quoting it. This is Radhakrishnan. A civilization without a metaphysics is like a temple without a holy of holies. Now, according to Manon's description of this, Radhakrishnan's scintillating sentences, and he's famous for being a great orator, and yet, of course, oratory is not something that's part of Chinese political culture. His scintillating sentences, however, went clean over the heads of the audience. And I can imagine, people didn't know the English very well. And Manon himself wrote in this kind of ironic, articulate style that suggests a great sophistication, but in my view, the irony and so on, that condemns both Indian and British bureaucratic elites to largely magisterial inactivity, as one of them himself admitted was the case. Chen Li-fu, Minister of Education, Confucian, politically significant, according to Manon, held forth on the value of philosophy and adorned his speeches and mystified his audiences by confused quotations from Confucius' Book of Changes. And then in response, Radhakrishnan set out his main thesis about the need for spiritual cultivation and argued that the one reason that China, India, unlike Rome and Babylon, were still going concerns, half alive perhaps, but still alive and not that, was because they attended to spiritual civilization. So largely this was something that really was not leading to a significant exchange of ideas. It was, if there is the West, there clearly is no East, and there was no meeting of East and West at all. But I want to turn to very briefly, if I can shoot it, with two other people, which are representatives of yet a different kind of imperialism. And I know those from Dutch archives. And one is Robert van Gulick, or van Gulick, who I suspect nobody here knows, but he actually is very interesting. He grew up in Jakarta. He was the son of a Dutch army doctor. He learned Chinese, then studied sinology at Leiden and joined the diplomatic service. He was in Japan at the time of Pearl Harbor, was evacuated, and then spent the war in Chongqing. There he fell in love and married a woman named Sui Shifan, and hang out with representatives of an old-style, let's say, Qing dynasty leftover elites. And he learned calligraphy and painting. He built up one of the best painting collections in the West, including of erotic prints. And he became really very much enmeshed in that quite traditional culture that he could find among the refugees in Chongqing. And then he started writing the stories that have earned him and his descendants vast amount of money. The Judge Dee stories that actually draw on the Chinese heritage to if you go on Amazon and you have some time, buy them. They are really good. And I think that actually sort of stands in contrast to that high-level exchange between people like Chun Li Fu and Radha Krishnan. Here is a guy who sort of ends up as a young man in this world. He learns from a more traditional, and that he incorporates in his own writing and his own collecting. He ended up teaching Chinese at Leiden, and he did a great job there. And he is hugely respected in Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. I'm going to mention one more person, which is yet a different kind of flow and imperialism. That's Tony Loving, a Dutchman, of course. He worked in the 1920s at the Chinese Maritime Customs Service in Shanghai. He helped prevent the communists from taking over the city at that time. And then because of that, the Chinese gave him a scholarship to learn Chinese for 2 years in Shenyang, of all places. And then he was called to Jakarta, where he worked for the civil service as an advisor on Asian affairs. In other words, an intelligence officer. He was sent to Australia when the Japanese occupied Indonesia. And he first went to London for the Dutch government in exile, but they didn't like him, so they sent him off to Chongqing. And one reason I'm going to give this quote, he was sort of at the end of the war, so after, there were all these sort of great schemes for about development, really. The UN was being set up and things like that. And he wrote this, and it sort of stuck always with me. And this is from Dutch archives. All those plans, proposals, and suggestions for committees, commissions, and institutes of all kinds, and individuals of all walk of life, seem to whirl about in my mind and create such a merry-go-round that I sometimes have disturbed dreams about gigantic offices packed with clerks and complicated electrical machines, which practice modern witchcraft, with on the very top one commanding key room, where a small number of supermen direct the political, financial, and economic destinies of all countries. That's not a bad prediction for somebody in 1944 to describe the world in which we live today. Okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you use the hand one, please.
Okay.
Yeah, let's take that one.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Shruti, Hans, and Chris for organizing this session and for inviting me to share some thoughts. As Shruti mentioned, my work deals with exploring the relationship between art and politics. And for the last 2 years, I've been focusing on a simple question, but I think it has complicated responses, on how states allocate resources for the arts, and particularly post-colonial states like India, or formerly colonized states like India. And India is important here because it's also a country that is at the center of my research. So the question that I ask, a little bit more focused, is what did the Indian statesmen want to do at the time of independence? What did they want to do with the arts? Indian independence happened in 1947, but it was also a moment which was voluminously enmeshed with violence, unemployment, poverty, and multiple other struggles of working out a future for the country and its people, while also dealing with the past of a long colonization. Understandably, there was no special attention given to the arts immediately. But what I found in my research is that despite it all, right from 47 onwards, the arts came to be looked after in almost all matters concerning politics and problem solving for a country, in the management of India's foreign affairs, in domestic integration, skill development, education. Constantly we saw that arts were being actually taken care of. So broadly, there were 3-4 ways, things that were happening to artistic activity, 47 to maybe the next 2 decades, at least till 67, 64 is when. And 3-4 things. First is there was a concern for preservation of what already exists. How do we preserve that? Second, how do we provide support that can help the continuation of certain art forms, but not others. So the state was making a very clear choice there. And third, of course, was the creation of a new, which is often called modern, idiom of Indian art. Today, what I wanted to do was share with you an extract from Jawaharlal Nehru's private papers that I found. And Nehru was, for those who don't know, India's first prime minister, but also till now, at least, India's longest serving prime minister. He was prime minister from 47 until 64, when he died. This is a letter, I think, it's a note that it doesn't mention to whom it is sent, but it's a note that was probably sent to the Ministry of Education, which was taking care of arts and culture at the time, but it might have been circulated within the Ministry of External Affairs as well from the content. So stay with me, and this is another way of reading history with all of you. I'm giving you Nehru's words here. Some questions were asked in Parliament. By the way, this is a note from 1956. Some questions were asked in the Parliament from time to time. They referred to Indian art treasures in the United Kingdom, and more especially to the India Office Library and to the Indian exhibits in the Victoria Albert Museum or the British Museum. I do not quite understand on what grounds to claim these art treasures back, except that we would like to have them back. That hardly seems to me an adequate ground. Every country collects art treasures from various parts of the world in its museums and art galleries. They make special efforts to get artistic and valuable exhibits from distant countries. The whole purpose and value of a museum is that it should exhibit a wide range of artistic objects from various parts of the world. In fact, great museums of London and Paris are full of exhibits from other countries. The American museums chiefly consist of articles purchased abroad either by private collectors or by the museum authorities themselves. Representatives of these great museums travel about all over the world, spending large sums of money for this purpose. If we had foreign artistic objects in our museums, as we should have, would we easily agree to part with them? I doubt it. Then again, from a purely national point of view, it may well be said by Pakistan that we have many artistic treasures which are of great interest to them, and they would like to have them, just as we may say that Pakistan has many treasures which we would like to have them in India. Nearly all these are lodged, he goes on about artistic treasures over 100 years and then says, nearly all these are lodged in national museums which are not purely government concerns. I really do not see how we can get these objects back. I can understand some particular object of great sentimental or historical interest to us being asked for, though even so, it would be difficult to get it. To ask odd countries like Egypt, Afghanistan, Czechoslovakia, Japan, Switzerland, and Turkey, which presumably have some few Indian artistic treasures, to return them to us, to me seems unreasonable and unjustifiable. Surely they want to keep some specimens of Indian art. Why should we object to that? The real question that arises in regards to the United Kingdom, that's the question. I remember the case of the Elgin marbles, which were taken away probably by Lord Elgin from Greece and now are in the British Museum. These were, I believe, just forcibly removed. The Greek government might have a claim to them, and I believe they have raised this question on some occasions. But there is not the least chance, as far as I know, of Elgin marbles being returned to Greece. If we can claim these art treasures from foreign museums, so can other countries. The principle is the same, except for the fact that the British control India. The result of these claims and counterclaims would be either a rejection of all of them or museums to be confined to their own national treasures and none others. The only reason which might be considered adequate by a foreign museum is when some such treasure has religious significance. Thus, we have obtained from the British Museum some ancient Buddhist relics. Some of these came a few years ago, others are arriving in a day or so. Because of the strong religious feelings about them, the British government agreed to hand them over. Because of this very feeling, we have agreed to send part of these relics to Burma and Ceylon. Apart from this reason, I see no other adequate ground for the foreign museums to part with their treasures from India, and are asking and our asking for them is not only likely to yield results, but will create difficulties. The most we can do is to select something of great historical value and try to get it back. Something may be of great sentimental or historical interest to us and not so much to the other country. If it has great artistic value, it would at least be of equal interest to the other countries, and they would not like to part with it. I think the last paragraph is the most important. I think, therefore, that it will not be advisable to address our missions on this subject at all. We should try to make as complete a list as possible of all these Indian objects abroad. Insofar as manuscripts are concerned, photostat copies or microfilms could be obtained. Having done all this, if we then think it necessary, we may concentrate on the recovery of a very few of such articles. Even so, we should be prepared to pay for them. To exploit our good relations with some of these countries to obtain free gifts from it of valuable articles does not seem desirable to me. On the other hand, it does seem to me desirable that foreign museums should have Indian objects of art. Responses to this note can be varied in range and sophistication, running anywhere from understanding the pragmatism of conquest and power, or, as it's fashionable today, accusing Nehru of not having done enough to fight for India's pride and getting the art treasures back, to arguing that national identity is not solely dependent on the ownership of few art treasures, and finally to overlooking the historical context entirely to understand the autonomy of artworks as non-human actors affecting and impacting the state of affairs. But another attempt to respond to Nehru's note involves shifting the ground slightly and asserting that there is a different kind of greatness for nations that have lost art treasures than those who have acquired, thereby postulating the existence of a distinctive and recognizable collection of art treasures based not on conquest, in injury or resentment, but rather largesse and cooperation, reinforcing thereby the distinctive character of the post-colonial condition and experience. Indeed, as this note shows, there are many ways in which we can rethink the past and learn for the future. This is just the start. Thank you.
Okay, the question onto you.
Thank you. I'm audible? Can you hear me well? Thank you. It's a great privilege to be part of this panel. I'm totally unprepared. Shruti asked me to be on it, but it's wonderful to listen to my colleagues and maybe share some thoughts in response. And also in what I have to say partly goes back to discussions in the 1980s, 90s and our growing up in post-colonial studies. Partly goes back to my memories of growing up in India, and also incorporates my experience of having been a student and then a teacher in Australia, and now for about 30 years in the US. So sort of partly, what I'm going to say is partly shaped by the US discussion this way about global humanities. And of course, the word globe is understood differently in different parts of the world. And so is the word humanities. And if you came to my campus today, the big debate is about whether media architecture should be part of humanities, whether the Social Science Research Council is just in New York, is just advertised fellowships in what they call just tech. So combining technology with questions of social justice. Because at least in America, the STEM subjects are, kind of winning the day, and humanities scholars find themselves on a back foot. So there's a lot so partly the discussion is coming out of a sense of crisis of the humanities, defined sometimes by availability of jobs, people's roots enrolling in humanities courses, those sorts of figures. But just to think very schematically, something I learned when I went to Australia, I knew about it, but I experienced a big difference. was between two kinds of imperial rule. So one was settler colonial, where the indigenous people actually lost their land, their lifestyle. The Australian Aboriginals were literally decimated through disease and other things in the 19th century. And they often lost their culture in the way that objects were taken away. So if you look at museums and the relationship to Native Americans, Canadian Indians, Australian Aboriginals, and the Maoris, you'll often find there's a real debate about who owns the objects of exhibition. Sometimes they're sacred objects that have been taken away without any sensitivity to their sacredness. Sometimes they're secret objects relating to women, what they call women's businesses. And there've been interesting resolutions. Sometimes there've been contracts between museums and these groups saying, okay, from now on, we are the owners, but you have them on lease from us. So their kind of legal status is changed. So there are those kind of debates which contrast nicely with Nehru's quite rationalist position. And of course, so I'm partly responding to Lian's use of museums and the politics of museums, but also Hans, your discussion about the relation of friendship between, particularly coming out of a sense that both India and China were countries fighting imperialism in different forms, and Nehru was very much affected by this. And when you look at, it's been a stalled friendship, as you know, but in the 50s it was full of possibilities. I have a student working on those years. But so on the one hand, you have these settled colonial countries with the relationship with indigenous humanities, if you want to call it so, was quite different from what happened in India. There's a long, of course, tradition of conversation about religion and other thing between European travelers and Indian in different parts of the country, translation between missionaries and Indian rulers. But more importantly, when I think of the roots of modern humanity, global humanities in India, of course, they go back to imperial times. And the fact is that the British ruled us by teaching us Shakespeare and Milton. Which had very interesting implications for how we thought about the world. Of course, on the one hand, the claim was that we have the better literature, and so we are more civilized. And our claim to rule is that we are more civilized civilization, which will now civilize you. You're a fallen civilization and bring you up. But what I find fascinating is how Indians came to love Shakespeare. It's still one of those countries where I think Shakespeare is most profound, and because India is a place where languages are still coming into being or coming into their own, claiming identities, and it's often one of the first writers to be translated for the production of plays Shakespeare. And there are tribal versions of Shakespeare. There are all kinds of filmic adaptations of Shakespeare that still go on. And I remember the first man who taught Shakespeare, one of the first people was a doctor in the company in the service of East India Company, D.O. Richardson, who's also a poet. And it's really interesting, when you teach some other countries' literature, it's not just the words, it's not the translations. You have to train your students to comport themselves, hold their bodies different. If you're going to act a character from Shakespeare, because that's what they used to do, you have to somehow learn to project your body differently than how an Indian person would normally hold their body together. And there's a tradition down to the 1930s when there were Indian professors of Shakespeare who copied Richardson, Richardson that is, whenever asked to explain a passage, used to act it out. So actually, being a character in Shakespeare plays was one way in which you learn to make cultural use of your body. And that itself gave a different experience of what being a person was while speaking English. And even now to my undergraduate year, there are very famous professor of Shakespeare studies, not published very much, but one of his articles was on the use of auxiliary verbs in Shakespeare. And imagine without a computer, how much labor of love that would have been to go through every page and find out how he used is and are and those kind of verbs. So it's this amazing thing that something that was used for the purpose of colonial domination also became an object of love on the part of the colonized. And on the other hand, you can think of similar transactions happening at particular times, like philology becoming a historical subject thanks to the exposure to Sanskrit that European colonial administrators had. So if I think about Indian humanities, so one of the things that comes up in humanities is, of course, old manuscripts. Now, India didn't have a tradition of cataloging manuscripts. They had libraries which got disrupted through wars and things, and when the Mughal Empire fell, a lot of these manuscripts were actually bought up by Europeans, and there are a British library in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and somewhere else. But it's quite interesting that the British government employed German scholars to come and produce the first catalogue of Sanskrit manuscripts. And these scholars employed Indian scholars to work for them as research assistants. And these Indian scholars who worked for them as research assistants then went back to their vernacular languages and started collecting and cataloging manuscripts on the same principles in which the German scholars have catalogued manuscripts. So you can see how deep this colonial relationship, in spite of all these problems, was that involvement of that relationship with the production of what you might call the core of the humanities, the text that you would actually then... I mean, today in Chicago, we teach people medieval and ancient languages in order for them to read those manuscripts. But without the British effort, actually German effort, because the British themselves were not as learned in Sanskrit as the Germans were, thanks to the translation of Shakuntala, and that the British actually had to go back to German scholars to come and do this. But at the same time, when the friendship with the India-China was also at the very beginning of Indians' interest in learning Chinese. I think of Tagore's China Bhavan in Shatanship. It happens precisely with Chinese scholars coming over from the Kuomintang side, I think, and starting the China. But one thing I was going to say was that come the 20th century, this question of what constitutes humanities, what constitutes humanity in human beings, and what constitutes civilization itself became an interesting problem. I might also say, even when you look at, if you think of modern knowledges, even like anthropology, theories of religion, think of Durkheim's elementary forms of religion. And it's so dependent on colonial anthropologists in Australia, like Baldwin Spencer and others, investigating Aboriginal forms of religion. So the modern knowledges are so entangled in the relationship of domination and subordination that it's, even when we today do modern global humanities, the thing to be aware of, it seems to me, is that the benign is never very far from what's malignant in global relationships. So that's the critical thing, and to be appreciative of that, the benign is never fully benign, and the malignant is never fully malignant. It's kind of both those aspects are present. So I'll just end by saying this, that so Gandhi is quick, as you know, when he came in the 1930s for the Roundtable Conference, and English journalists asking him what he made of what he thought of Western civilization, and him saying that it would be a good idea. But what I find fascinating is the way in which, in this, just to talk about Britain and India for the time being, is how people like Gandhi and Tagore, while accepting a lot of European interpretations of Indian pasts. So Gandhi's understanding of the Gita, for instance, was deeply indebted to Theosophists' explanation and translation. Initially, but he didn't know much Sanskrit. But at the same time, what I still think was of lasting value in that conversation was Tagore particularly recognizing, and Gandhi too, that what was fascinating about a Europe, Britain included, that was molding the entire world into a shape where people were getting and Japan is a very interesting example. People were getting the idea that in order to be a powerful nation, you have to be like Britain or you have to be like European nations. And the Japanese deliberately modernized themselves and became European without having been colonized. So there's clearly kind of moral pressure. But within that, there was a recognition that this Europe that was red in tooth and claw and dominated everybody was also producing knowledge, understanding, propositions that the dominated, the colonized could use back as weapons of criticism, or as critical weapons. I mean, in the Indian logic, I'm sure Marxism and liberalism were those two weapons that you could, the European products of European thought, but which you could turn around and apply to Europeans. And in that sense, when I read this literature, I feel it was as though Gandhi and Tagore, the anti-colonial thinkers, were essentially saying, look, there is no way you can have a world that is innocent of power. And you can't have a humanities that is innocent of power. But a question you can ask, and I think this is a question that Europe of that period, probably it's a test that Europe passes, which is that you have to have a civilization that produces enough self-criticism so that you create resources which the dominated can use in order to criticize you. And so I think of Marxism, I think of liberalism as precisely, and feminism as these forms of thought which you could then make into your weapons. So I often think of, when I think of India and China today, China is a superpower. And India as a wannabe superpower. It's not a superpower. But I ask my Indian friends, I ask my Chinese friends, I completely wish them well. In the sense that in wanting to be rich countries, dominating countries, powerful countries, but I also want to remind them there's no benign powerful country. A powerful country, if you're powerful, you're going to tread on some toes, you're going to, some people are going to be unhappy about what you do. And then the question is, if you are powerful, and if by definition you're dominant, then I ask, what are the resources from within your civilization, from within your past, from the history of entanglement with European thought, that you are going to offer to those you're going to dominate as weapons they can turn against your oppression and your domination. That, for me, is the test of a civilization. But a civilization cannot attain that position until it produces self-criticism, until there are a whole lot of intellectuals producing a critique of that civilization. Whereas just look at Britain, there's Adam Smith, Modern Economy, there's John Ruskin critiquing Adam Smith. There's Gandhi actually feeding off John Ruskin. So the long tradition of Christians, my friend Leela Gandhi's one of his great granddaughters, wrote a wonderful book on Gandhi, where one of the peculiar things she showed was that Gandhi was becoming friends by marginal Europeans, the gay people, the vegetarians, the missionaries, who actually felt marginal with respect to the imperial thrust of Europe that belonged to European. I mean, one great example in Indian history is, of course, Charles Freer Andrews, the missionary person who worked for the indentured coolies, he worked for Gandhi, worked for Tagore, he lived in India. I mean, there are many other, Annie Besant, Margaret Noble, many Europeans you can think about. And Tagore was always saying, look, you have to remember that there's always protest alive within Europe against Europe's injustices. And that's the space that civilization has to create. If there's a modern civilization of a powerful country that stamps out dissent, it will not give us these weapons. Because the weapons have to be homegrown, and they have to come out of a civilization's realized need that in order to be properly civilized, because you can't ever be perfectly civilized, you have to create room for dissent. And so there we are in there. Thank you very much.
Helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. I won't take very long, but I'm just going to open the discussion. And I was kind of quite struck by Dipesh's rather optimistic take on the promise of knowledge for, critique, dissent, protest, remaking. And it actually made me, I have just two questions, one on knowledge and another on, as it were, China, India, Asia. So, but I'll start with you first, because it's sort of striking, because when I was a graduate student, the debates that came from Chicago and Cambridge, the debate between Chicago and Cambridge was the debate about the benign versus malignant form of colonial knowledge, right? That was the divide on the ocean. And yet, I mean, it strikes me because, of course, that was an academic debate of scholarship. But today, these debates are very much public debates. They're part of polemics, certainly in this country, very much a part of so-called culture wars. But what I find fascinating is that the term that is used here is, of course, decolonization, right? Whether it's of curriculum, repatriation, what have you. That same term in India is used by Modi. It's not a term that is used by, as it were, people who would have, trained in, say, whatever, left-leaning, liberal, the kind of stuff that we read in JNU, say, 15 years ago. So I find the kind of, I wouldn't say skirting of politics. I mean, it's a very optimistic reading that you have. But on the other hand, I feel that I'm looking for an explanation as to why at this very moment, those things actually which we knew in the ivory tower, say Cohn versus Bailey versus Indian versus, Edward Said, these have now become so, as it were, weaponized that they are part of, as it were, ministerial, proclamations here, there, everywhere, right? I mean, cultural Marxism is, for instance, to be blamed for many things by many politicians today in this country. So I'm curious to push you, because you've also written on public life of history in India, why you think we have emerged at certain impasse, which is actually not very optimistic about knowledge at all. It's either instrumental or it is about ownership. So that's my, who gets to say what and, and who has what, very much like, so I'm interested in that. And I think the word decolonization to me already is instructive because who uses it, where and how. Because someone like Nehru refused the term in his own lifetime because he saw it as a category of the Cold War, for one, plus, of course, as political actor, whether it was Gandhi or Nehru, they didn't think they were decolonizing themselves, they were becoming free. So these are completely, for them, different categories. So I'm interested in the politics of the kind of, what you've said. It's is at odds again with the public life of this debate, which has had a very long genealogy, at least of 30 years of criticism in the academy. So that's really, where does the optimism come from? And to me, actually, Nehru is interesting because Nehru is forging friendship but suturing colonialism. And I'm quite struck by what Malvika has said, particularly now that the repatriation of objects, it hasn't really made as much news, is part of the free trade agreement negotiations. The Telegraph carried a huge, so by stealth, the Indian missions are now going to demand as part of the negotiation. So it's about trade rather than objects. It's about, it's that kind of instrumentalization, not so much about national culture, but what is India going to be able to bargain out of Britain in terms of the free trade agreement. So that's really about Nehru and Nehru's role in creating a kind of post-imperial friendship with Britain, and how do we assess it? And so that's to you. But then a similar question actually to Hans and to Ness, to you, because of course you were teaching British history in China, and it's a very interesting thing you mentioned. You mentioned it's a failed dialogue, and I was interested in, like, the word Asian century is being used again. It's come back in. And in the early 20th century, the word, again, optimism was Pan-Asianism, that there was going to be Japan, China, India. This was going to be a kind of Pan-Asian New World Order, which actually gets stalled even earlier than the 40s. I mean, it depends. I mean, you're saying it's 50s. You could argue that in the interwar period, it's already ended. So I was interested, Hans, from you to hear, since you are working so interestingly on Indian interlocutors in China and vice versa, as a Chinese historian, how do you explain, for want of a better word, a lack of friendship between China and India? Quite apart from their, and I don't mean diplomatically, I mean in terms of ideas, that there is actually a very different valuation of knowledge in these societies. Is this something to do with the nature of imperial experience itself, in the sense that the British imperial experience is so much knowledge-driven in India, that, if you go with Kohn, that's really what makes the empire possible. So I'm actually really interested in now, where would you see the optimism on the Asian question, given that whether it's 44, whether it's in the 1930s, or whether it's 62, when the war happens, how would you explain this? And not simply in terms of geopolitical competition, but the valuation of, say, the humanities itself. So, yeah, why don't you start and then the Dipesh can conclude, or you want to start? Either way.
Go ahead.
I'd love to hear you.
And then we open it up.
I hope these are difficult questions. I mean, and, I've dabbled in Indian history and read some arguments, so I can't say very much. I was struck into the Nehru fascination with China. First, and so the meetings of Chiang Kai-shek stepping into Indian history, actually very interesting ways, but that failing, and it's the British and the Americans saying, no, we're not going to do this, the quit India moment, and so on. So that's, Nehru goes to China, he's in China in important moments in 39, and so these are all, just this lovely moment, which I keep quoting in Chiang Kai-shek's diaries, which I think goes some way probably to explaining some of the problems. When Chongqing is being bombed, Nehru is visiting, and they sit up in a hill in Chiang Kai-shek's house, and they have to go to bomb shelter. And Nehru wants to talk. And Chiang Kai-shek simply writes in his diary, I just want to sleep. And I think there is something to it. And then Nehru goes to China and he describes Chinese food habits, which he finds disgusting. Because they're all eating from the same thing. Yeah, this is gross, and the Chinese food is not very filling. I think I think these kinds of things matter. There are different, I hate the word culture actually, but there are different ways of expression, engagement, dealing with each other. So that's, I think, in why it did not happen after 44.
Except that India is the first country to recognize PRC.
That's right.
And
exactly right. And so you have people like Manon, who I think actually very interesting. And there's a whole family there that actually going to be critical in the future. Yeah. The Manon family. And, I did meet Shankar Manon, and his understanding of China is amazing. And we got great discussions. So I'm not at all hopeless, but it means, I think, so one of the things I will, as Shruti knows, what I will do in the fall in Beijing is bring Chinese and Indian historians together, because I told to the Peking University leadership, this is crazy. Indian historians are not talking to Chinese historians. Chinese historians are not talking to Indian historians. This is nonsense. This is not the kind of world that we should be living in. And that is, to me, precisely what global humanities is about. I'm also bringing in Indonesian historians because they are forgotten by everybody. They, as a huge, fourth largest country in the world, so little representation in our discussions. And I can say that as a Dutch guy, all the problems with that. So, in that sense, I can't explain it, but Nehru's willingness to sign away, maybe even large parts of what might be considered part of the Indian area of the world, including Tibet. I mean, these are very sensitive issues, obviously. I don't understand why he, and people like Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek, they came in quite hard and said, come on, go away. And it's the South China Sea issues begins at that point. So, and I don't quite understand Nero's position on that. I mean, he's clearly a politician. He's a very shrewd politician in so many ways. And it's even with the non-aligned movement, it goes wrong from the beginning when the Chinese come in and take this away from. So Nero's great hope is creating this new world.
Yeah, that's right.
Through the non-aligned nations. And for the Chinese to come in and say, okay, we're forgetting the Soviets because they're letting us down, but now, so we're going to join this, and then they take it over. And Nero, presumably, is quite frustrated by that, but also has no answer. So I don't understand it. It's a question.
You want to say something?
I don't think I can really give lots of comments, but talking back to my courses, I just encourage a student to make a presentation about India. And I found they are quite interested with lots of things, because Gandhi is always the most popular person to talk about. And especially his experience in South Africa and in India, and some Indians visit in China in the first part of the 20th century. And even those modern enterprises and big companies also attract their interests. So yes, maybe in lots of political debates or on newspaper, you see, well, the relationships quite diplomatical, and you see lots of statements. But in the personal level, I think this younger generation is still quite interested in India in other ways, because in Chinese social media, you maybe see lots of memes. But even these memes, it shows interest are quite strong. And if going back to the ancient Chinese history, they always talk about India because of the Buddhism. So this historical link is quite strong. And we have Indian center working on this, and we have lots of Pakistan students on campus. So I think the link is there. But the question is how to make it a statement or more obvious to the outside world. This kind of link is already making. How to make others. It's not like those statements or these political narratives. So that's be very little expense.
Actually, I have been thinking about this a lot. Like over the last, I think, 5-7 years, art treasures and bringing them back has been a big moment for this government. They do it with a lot of fanfare. And Shruti, I think the answer is in the question or the comment that you made, which is that you use the term bargain. When we're able to bargain is when we have, it's a moment in time that Nehru feels rather vulnerable. What the note shows, and many other letters shows, that he doesn't want to touch conflict, again, not over art. And this is also what shows us art's a little bit of a lesser status. Do we really went over art to, troubled relations? He's not willing, clearly. And I think that's where the art specificity lies.
Is it friendship or is it vulnerability?
I think it's a bit of both. And I was just about to use the term. Nehru is very interested in, as the note shows, friendly relations. Is that a mark of weakness, though? As we've been told many, many times, if suppose we take it, yes, even if he wanted to put friendly relations ahead, that may or may not be a mark of weakness.
For him it wasn't.
It wasn't, certainly. So, and I think the last line of the note was very carefully written. And doesn't write an extra word. His letters show he's a careful writer. And I think there's genuine interest in having Indian art outside, and to really think of it as a collection of art
that's international.
That's international, that it's India's, but it's just out of India. And having said all this, I think there was that if you read between the lines, he's sort of also reminding us that art is independent of all this. It can't be autonomous. It's not just an ownership that we get. I mean, the artworks that are coming back, you know the state of museum.
Yeah.
We've already, let's be pragmatic. 56 is also the time where the National Museum building hasn't come up. It only came up early 60s. And they are struggling deeply with space to put all these objects. A lot of the princely states are writing to the central government that we have so much artwork, we can't manage the museums, we want to give it. And Nehru and Azad are constantly saying, no, we can't. And therefore the trade and the antique markets really boomed in the 50s and the 60s because these Maharajas had no choice but to sell these artworks outside. Yeah.
Think Tipeshal, then we look.
Yeah. I'll come to the question of optimism.
Yes.
Just make two or three remarks. So it's going back to this India-China friendship. So as you know, probably in 1950, the US sent feelers to Nehru through his sister, who was then India's permanent rep in the UN Assembly, Lakshmi Pandit, offering, we're basically asking if India would be interested in a permanent seat in the Security Council. Right. And Nehru writes back saying, not at the cost of China.
Yeah.
That's
all coming to haunt everybody.
Yeah. Now everybody's blaming Nehru for having said that. But the thing is, he thought India and China are both on the anti-imperial side. And he was not going to play to the game of the Cold War and be sort of, the West puppet boy working against China, because this was the height of the Cold War. So there are Chinese delegations coming to India using the word friendship. Yeah. And an Indian delegation. So the 50s, it's Nehru who brings Chongqing to the Bandung conference against British and American opposition. So I think, whether that view is fully shared by the Chinese side, that there's a common anti-imperial heritage, I don't know. Mao was as desirous to have M. N. Roy shut up. But so I have an interesting question there. I just curious. Shruti, this. So there are models of understanding, which think of cultures as personalities or groups as personalities. So from Heidegger to Gadamer to even Stiegler, all these German thinkers who have thought of technology have often thought what their fear was that technology was bringing the world together far too quickly before we have developed an understanding of each other's cultures. So that was their fear. And in many ways, post-colonialism was when I read Homey, and they're like assuring these old German uncles, don't worry, we're coming together, we're still interested in different things. But what I think, if you think of cultures as personalities, and if you think a culture presenting itself as having solutions to the world's problems, which is sometimes how present-day decolonizers present the indigenous tradition as saying there are all the solutions of the world in the indigenous traditions. My question is always to them, if this is your culture and you want me to adopt it, you first have to tell me what is it that you don't like about your culture and you wouldn't like for that to continue. You can be my guide to your culture only when you have a certain critical relationship, right? If your relationship is completely loyal, then it's kind of completely oblivious to questions of power and the relationship with power comes. So my optimism lies in the fact that human beings are going to ask this question. I think, and I go back to Hannah Arendt saying that it is in human difference that the hope lies for novelty and newness. Right? So dissent is ultimately based in our differences, even between you and I, right? Sure. Sort of that we can disagree, and we always know that not all disagreements are resolvable, right? But to value disagreement, to value dissent, I think, however we go forward, that's something we can't give up on, and that's why. But I feel it's not exhorting people to demand that. I think humans will demand that. That doesn't mean that there are no problems with liberalism. That doesn't mean that there are no problems with certain kind of democracy and or probably all kinds of democracy, right? That doesn't mean that there is no, even within these democracies, which have become like shell democracies, managerial, people are trying to manage. So the last question of decolonization, and it's used now in Modi's India. So people who write, I mean, I've not heard Modi use the word, but people who write like Sai Deepak. And
Yeah,
others,
I mean, his people, I mean,
so they use decolonization with regard to the Muslims.
as well.
Much more what the Muslims tend, but I mean, British as well, but I mean, really, so it's really sort of, I mean, they don't even explain in what sense the Muslims were colonizers. And then, but the thing is, it's two pieces of evidence I want to give to you in this current debate.
Sure.
One is this Brazilian anthropologist called Vigueiros de Castro, who is a major thinker of indigeneity and today, right? But if you look at his work, the work owes so much, and he would deny it, to the way in which French anthropology in Africa and Latin America contributed to dissident thinking in May 1968. So if you read Deleuze's those couple of books, right, The Thousand Pictures of Capitalist Australia, you will see a chapter that is dedicated to Claude Zifon, Society Against State. So they were actually using this anthropology of kind of chiefless society or Sephardic societies to produce a critique of the modern state, to produce a critique of centralizing Communist Party ideas, right? So, and Vigueiros is absolutely, he's in Paris those years. So when he goes and studies the indigenous people, it's influenced by what Deleuze and Guattari are saying in the rhizomatic connection and all of those things. And the other example is a very good example of a Native American famous woman called Robin Wall Kimmerer, who comes from one of those tribes in Illinois, and she has a very interesting book called Braiding Sweetgrass. Right? And what she does, so she has this chapter, she's actually a trained botanist. And she in her language, she says what she owes to science. So she says, when I look at a mushroom, botany gives me the capacity to describe it precisely, understand its biology, right, its cell structure, whatever. But then she says, but when the mushroom just comes up from the soil, and it's wet all over, the soil is slippery, he said that act of its coming up, just pushing its head out. She said that for that event, there's a word in my language, which botany doesn't give. Now, that's true, but she might have found it in romantic poetry, in European romantic poetry. It's not like Europe is lacking those languages. But what I'm saying to both of these is that this is a very entangled world, where we're already entangled, and that's what Kimmerer is saying. That she's not saying I'm about to give up on botany and only go back to my languages, but she's saying botany doesn't give me something which my language gives me. And I think that movement of the decolonial rhetoric, which says, let's forget all this and go back to something original, they're forgetting how entangled we are. And my optimism is that entanglement can be nourished only by recognizing differences. And therefore the question of disagreement, dissent, dissidence is critical in defining global humanities.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up. Yes, Frisbee.
Thank you so much.
Frisbee, that's skip last.
Oh, you invited. 2 minutes.
Thank you. I enjoyed that very much. So I just wanted to, if I may, address Professor Chakrabarti and ask a question. So if I've understood you right, the thought is we can't free ourselves from dynamics of power, but it can be tempered by enabling forms of knowledge production that encourage or enable dissent and a critical stance. And I just had perhaps an example and then a question. So the example is, I was fascinated to learn recently that that Gandhi translated and disseminated Plato's Apology and took Socrates as a model of civil disobedience. Yes. And apparently that was seized and banned by the British authorities and seen as an act of colonial resistance. And so I've learned this from a wonderful paper by Flores on my topic. So I think that's quite a nice example where dissent is built into that kind of mode production. But my question is this, that at the moment there are quite a lot of debates in the UK and I gather in the US too about the state of the humanities and an increasing homogeneity and ideological conformity. And I work on the ethics and politics of dialogue in Socrates and Hannah Arendt, and I'm concerned about that. So I'd like to ask you, how do you think we can foster better a culture of dissent, where we embrace disagreements and see that as a positive and creative force?
Yeah. You know, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. It's become it's a very difficult situation to negotiate. But we have to negotiate it, because what has happened in America, at least in my experience, I'll see a lot of movements, they're progressive movements, like the changes they want to see are changes you would support, but have also, for historical reasons, they've come to found their movements on rage and anger. And because of the rage and anger, the movement themselves become quite censorious and quite intolerant of opposition, but this is happening in the middle of a lot of pain. I mean, today I was speaking with some friends about, and this will have to be part of humanity, I can't say it. The whole question of the way in which, for many in America, that I will not hear, but the question of sexual identity, sexual preference is getting tied up with the question of recognition, rights, pain, difficult surgeries. And this is rife in American university. Actually, it's rife in schools. It's coming from schools, and we have to deal with it. And sometimes I was saying, Shruti, that I can't get my head around, but I can see that it's real. That their pain and are all real, and I don't always understand it. So when there's pain and anger and things, movement becomes censorious. But the question is, how do you encourage them to open up space for discussion, for disagreement? That's the struggle, I feel, in the humanity, is to keep that space open. And I feel optimistic in the long run, because I think that's what humanity is. Our humanness is based on both our capacity to collaborate, but also to disagree. And that's why I think if you produce a form of rule which is discouraging of dissent, and that's where India is at the moment, largely, I can't see that having a long-term productive, that being a long-term productive situation.
Cancer, just in the middle.
Thank you so much, and that's really very productive. I am very sensitive to this idea of different, which means underlines all points. Can you speak up a little bit? Which was I'm very sensitive to this idea of dissent, which was underlined several times by our colleague, Professor Chakraborty. And I completely agree with this idea that European imperialism, the global effects, and all of the things they are now also produced critical and very evaluational and critical vision. I think it's useful. So I worked on racism, and I realized that it was the exclusion of rights. And now I'm working more on rights, so you get the side of the equation. And I'd like to know how you introduce this issue of rights nowadays with these four big powers, which are empires, China, India, Russia, United States, and arguably also Europe. How can we introduce dissent? And I agree, without dissent, without discussion, it's quite viable we are heading to. But on the other hand, how rights can really empower people and respond and embody this idea of critical reasoning and maybe others.
Yeah.
It's a question to you.
But yeah, I want to open, but rights and art and then.
No, it's a question to you.
Okay, no, I mean, thank you for the question. Right, so now the question of rights in the humanities has become such an interesting question. So my colleague Martha Nussbaum has just written a book on rights of animals, just come on. So if you think of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation book, 1970s, so this is decades after that, and obviously that itself shows where we are, at least in some parts of the West, with regard to the question of rights, because now you realize there's already been debates about whether rivers should have rights, mountains should have rights. And when you extend rights like this, you also then realize that, I was saying to another forum, the majority forms of life on this planet are microbial. And it's very hard to imagine giving them rights. So in a way, something that global humanities will have to deal with is the crisis of the environmental degradation. And what it has produced is this attempt to extend human conceptions of recognition and legal entitlements to other entities. And in doing so, you realize that there are limits to how far you can extend it. And so if you think of the history of rights, I often think if you go back to John Stuart Mill, then the assumption was that rights were like concentric. You had individual rights, you had group rights, you had national rights, then maybe human rights, right? So you thought, all right, but in the last part of the 20th century, we have had an explosion of rights. And sometimes one right contradicts another right. One example question that came up in Australia in my time was, who has the right to punish? Now, Aboriginals don't accept that the Australian state has entire sovereignty. They still want sort of some degree of sovereignty. So there was a case in which the traditional punishment for the man who was the offender, he was in jail by Australian state law. And the traditional punishment for the tribe was for his leg to be speared. Life to be spared, but leg to be speared. So they said, when he gets out of jail, we are going to bring a spear and spear his leg. And then the Australian judge was saying, no, you can't punish somebody twice for the same offense. And this produced a very interesting debate about this kind of unfinished matter of colonial occupation of Australian land. And the fact that Australia had never been ceded. There was never any treaty signed. Unlike in New Zealand, the Waitangi Treaty, unlike in Northern...
Unlike the Diwani.
All the princely treaties, or in North America, there were all treaties signed. And but Australia was taken over on this assumption that it is an empty land. There was nobody to sign a treaty with. These are like kangaroos. You can't sign treaty with kangaroos. So it brought up this whole question of the colonial past, the nature of colonial rule. It wasn't satisfactorily resolved because the state has more power. They could say no, But the Aboriginal groups were fighting to eventually then ask the state to define sovereignty not as a zero-sum game, but come up with the idea of graded sovereignty. That within the nation, you would give them sovereignty on certain other, which has also happened in North America, similar discussions. So when you look at the history of rights today, you kind of see both the non-human rights question actually informing of the limits to the conception of rights. But also, when you look at the human discussions, you see that there's been an explosion of rights talk. And I think Malvika was saying, Timothy Garton Ash, the Oxford historian, went to India maybe 10, 12 years ago and wrote his account of his travels, first time in India, 12 years ago, I think. And I remember what he wrote. He said he found that the biggest right in India, not a legal right, but the biggest right, was the right to take offense.
Yeah.
what you said. Some group was or other was hurt.
Always.
By, always.
Always,
Yeah. And these are not even legal rights, but they're kind of getting accepted as cultural rights. So people are extremely careful. So there can be notions of rights and demand for rights, which again become censorious. So sometimes, so if you produce a textbook with things that people don't like, a group doesn't like, find it offensive, they will come and vandalize the offices of the authors. And in one such case, one of the authors was a friend of mine. And he said they were very polite. They came and said, you just go and stand outside. We'll just vandalize the furniture. You won't be hurt. And then they wait for television to come so that they get publicity. So it's a very complex, evolving situation. But I don't think you can hold the rights concept sharply enough to deal with all possible situations.
Malvika wants to say something, and then on to you.
Yeah, I want to ask you. It's interesting that you mentioned the rights of rivers and rights of non-human entities. In many cultures, you mentioned Aboriginal cultures, but also in India, for instance, the importance of rivers and land and sea. It's bizarre to think it's within the sovereignty of the state, that the state has control over, because something else has control over. My question is, we have the conception of the modern state, which is not matching with the conception of alternative ideas of recognition and rights. So while this is expanding on one side, actually we're falling back to this singular idea of the modern state. And why is there no change on the side of the state or elsewhere? We're talking at this time, the modern state, as it were. The language of the state isn't changing, but the language everywhere else is changing.
Nice. Yeah.
So this will actually never have
Full complement.
exactly, yeah, complement.
That's right.
Sure. But thank you, all of you. It's wonderful. And I was going to ask a question to you, which I will, but I'll also mention that we have just started a Global Humanities project, which is at the intersection of migration studies and plant humanities, and that's really brought up this thinkers of to rights that you're talking about, but also how the histories of rights and indeed of citizenship, which were for a long time good histories, have become parts of potentially French histories. I mean, look at what's happening in India. So that was interesting, and I have lots of questions, but I'll just pick up one thing. I loved the fact that you picked up on how Shakespeare is an object of love, and I've grown up with that too. And Shakespeare is one of the things I teach. And I was interested, though, in the way you talked about the cultural experience of the body and how Shakespeare in India is about projecting the body in a British Shakespearean way.
Inhabiting in a different way.
I was thinking about the opposite, and I don't know if this is shaped or if it was already happening. I think it was already happening. I've heard my grandfather recite Shakespeare in a completely Indian way, and it culturally estranges the text. And I think that the body can estrange the text. And when I hear, see, near in Fakafuni, or, I'm not hearing British Shakespeare. And, Kamal Braithwaite said that the hurricane does not roar in pentameters. In a place when you transport something, it deforms form.
Sure.
And I guess, I'm seeing many of us Shakespeareans battling with the fact that Shakespeare is a toxic cultural legacy for, increasingly vast demographies. And we are having to decolonizing by learning what Malvika wonderfully called largesse of a kind, and I'm reimagining what we talk about when we talk about love. And Shakespeare would be fine with it because a play text wasn't anyone's property. It's very much in tune with that. So I just kind of wanted to pick that up and, you can speak to it or comment on it, because I think the performative body is such an interesting side of decolonizing.
No, thank you. And I totally agree with you. There are many kind of literally incorporation of Shakespeare, comprehensive. what I was usually saying to say was in the 19th century, or even to the days of Sir P.C. Ghosh, who taught Shakespeare, and my only access to his style of teaching, mind you, I was a student of physics, so I didn't do these classes, was to Shubodh Sengupta's memories of P.C. Ghosh's teaching. And, people loved his teaching, and he used to teach on weekends, comedy lectures, and he used to also act them out. But for a lot of these people, so it was like occupying a certain habitus, right? And clearly over time, I mean, the digitalization has also happened. I'm not denying it, but whatever happens, it's never beyond the questions of power. I mean, it's like indigenization is not innocent of power, but it might be impinging on other issues of power.
Yeah. Shubha, thank you so much. And I loved what you said about Shakespeare. In one of the archives in Cambridge, I found a notebook of a master in Doon School. He was an Englishman teaching in Doon School, and he stayed on, some of the few masters who stayed on. This is early 50s, 51, 52. And in the day he would teach, as in Doon School that happens, you take the classes, he would teach English, and in the evening he used to help them with their theatre production. For one annual production, they decided to do Hamlet. And in his notebook, he writes, I tried to teach them how to speak Hamlet, but they all started reciting like a Sanskrit shlok. Their body moves back and forth. And then he said, should I let Hamlet be theirs? It's wonderful. Yeah. So that's exactly what you're saying.
Great. So do you both want to make some final comments before we close the discussion? It's time.
No. Can I say one?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, just quickly. I mean, something would be relevant to this group is so. In the 60s, I became a failed Maoist. Now, so I was one of the early failures. Everybody failed as Maoists in India, but I was one of the first to fail.
Congratulations.
Right. But in that phase, like reading Mao, with no knowledge of Chinese humanities, poring over an essay on his criticism of the eight-legged essay, not knowing what the eight-legged essay was all about, but kind of treating it as sacred. So, I mean, I think of those kind of conversations, completely blind. And I think one great potential of this group is actually, because there are what you might regard as national or local traditions of humanities, which you can recognize as humanities tradition. And one of the interesting things about Mao is that, I mean, he is in that sense a critique of a lot of Chinese literature as he received it, and forms of writing, genres of writing, and he's himself a poet. But we were reading him in the middle of a political movement where we made a cult of him, and even tried to learn by heart the telegrams he was sending, because they're all published as part of the selected works in 4 volumes, and even including telegrams, send wheat or whatever. And but now as I think back, I think there was in the poetic tradition, in the calligraphic tradition. I mean, these are all deep traditions of humanities, and they were again. This is the thing about humanities. They were appealing to us, even though we didn't know a thing. I mean, we could not understand why the cultural revolution started with a play called High Jew Dismissed from Office. They're ancient characters. Why are they fighting one ancient character? They're fighting a contemporary battle. But it's really about how they fight their battles, right? So, but I think of that moment. I think how one gets drawn to another culture, tradition, in a historical situation, even without knowing anything about it. But it's still a moment of opening up, and leaves a deposit for life.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Hans, yes.
I think the discussion about Mao could become very interesting.
It could be
There's
a global Mao.
There's a global Mao. There's Maos. There's lots of different kinds of Maos. I found a fake Mao.
You found a fake Mao?
In Dutch archives, I found a Mao text in English that said something about liberation struggle. Mao never wrote it.
Right.
But the Indonesian revolutionaries, probably Tan Malaka, probably wrote it as drawing the style. And I often sort of, would congratulate you on leaving Mao early. I often think of some sort of Mao was probably taken more seriously, or at least differently, than he ever was in China or by himself. More Maoist than it's certainly a European thing as well. But at the same time, there is a lot in Mao which is actually very important to think about imperialism, culture, Chinese culture, and that's sort of it. And I think one of the differences between India and China is that India dealt with one kind of imperialism, many forms, and also many places are not really. But it's what I think of as these are double imperialisms. People like Mao and Gandhi and Nehru and Shafir and so on are not only responding to European, but also to Qing imperialism, Mughal imperialism. And once we begin to think about that, I think that's when we can begin to get a discussion between Chinese and Indian that gets beyond the Indian experience.
And forms of disagreement that you have to recognize.
That's right.
You may not immediately see it as dissent, but there are traditional
That's right.
homegrown forms of disagreement.
And then we can begin to sort of move beyond the Indian-British thing, and there's a sort of a much broader Asian discussion about this experience. And Japan is responding in different ways, and so on. And of course, in the Second World War, there's far more admiration to Japan everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. This run over, but many, many thanks to this wonderful panel, Hans, Linden, Malvika, and the Bishop. Thank you very much.